Good morning, everybody, and I hope you're all well and happy and that you've had a good week so far and that you've had a chance to enjoy a little bit of the warmer weather. We're going to be doing three things today. We're going to start off by doing our work, and then at 11:30, we're going to stop. And at that point, I would appreciate it if one or more of you, when we get to 11:30, would just call out orally, not in a chat, and just say, "Hey, Professor, it's 11:30. We need to change topics." Okay? I'm going to try to keep track of time, but if I miss, because I tend to talk a lot, I'm going to spend 45 minutes on the work. And then in the last half hour, what we'll do is I'll take your questions about some of the questions on the exam. And if we don't finish that, we could always do more of that next week. We're not leaving town. And then we'll go over the homework, and that'll take us to noon. So at 11:30, somebody call out and say, "Hey, Professor, stop. It's 11:30." Um, so I want to dive right in. And I want to start with something I showed you on Monday. And this is the quantity equation, or the equation of exchange. I'm starting with this because this morning, one of the measures of inflation that we talked about on Monday, the consumer price index, actually came out for the month of February. And what's instructive about it was really a few things that we alluded to actually on Monday. On a month-over-month basis, inflation was up 0.4%. But that was the all items. But you may recall I made a distinction between all items and the core inflation rate, which leaves out the inflation in food and energy. So instead of being up 0.4, if you look at the core, which excludes food and energy, the consumer price index was up 0.1%, which means for the most part, we're not seeing on an aggregate basis terribly much inflation. On a year-over-year basis, meaning looking at February of this year versus February of last year, we're still way below the Fed's 2% target. But remember, I said the Fed doesn't target the consumer price index. The Fed targets the personal consumption expenditures deflator, which also is running cold. It's running below 2%. So I thought I would point that out to you. Heartily recommend that you just take a few minutes. That's all it takes, is to go to BLS, as in Bureau of Labor Statistics, bls.gov, pull up, it's right there for you to see, pull up the report on the February Consumer Price Index, and just take a look at some of the numbers. But if you go down to like the third page of the report, we get the answer to one of the questions, one of you so acutely asked on Monday, which is basically, how do they calculate this kind of thing? You'll see an explanation for how the consumer price index is actually put together. So bls.gov, it'll just take you a few minutes. Go to the page where they explain how they actually do this survey and how they look at these 80,000 different goods and services, and you'll get a sense of that. Once again, goods inflation, or inflation in the price of goods, has run ahead of inflation in services, but the services have been held back by the slowness with which we've been vaccinated and things are opening up. So what we're watching for is what's going to happen when we get goods inflation and services inflation. Is the consumer price index in this particular case going to start to run hotter than 0.1% for the core? So I thought I'd point that out to you. This is the quantity equation. And a couple of things about this I want to make sure that you get. You'll remember I said the left side, MV, is sort of like a spending side. It's the amount of money times velocity, which is the bang for the buck. It's the amount of GDP, or national income per dollar of money supply. That's how you think of velocity. And the right side, PY, is obviously going to be equal, because if I spend $1, you earn $1. So think of PY as being the earnings side. And that is, if I sell three things and each thing is $2, P times Y, $6 of GDP. And price level times real GDP is nominal GDP. So this could say MV equals PY equals GDP, because that's what it is. But I want to show something else to you that will jog your memory from your math classes If you haven't taken any math in college, well, you certainly did this in high school. So let me get to a different slide. Just give me a moment, and I'll get to a slide because it brings up a very important point. Come on, Steve. Okay. And here we go. Where you see G, that means growth rate of. So you'll remember MV equals PY. But here you see GM, or the growth of the money supply, plus the growth of velocity equals the growth of prices, which is inflation, plus the growth of real income. Think about this for a moment. Jog your memory. Here comes a word that you probably haven't heard in a while unless you've taken some math at Queens College. Remember logarithms? And you remember when you studied logarithms either in high school or you did math, at the college level? And maybe your professor put X, Y on the board, X times Y or A times B. Let's do A times B. So on the board is AB. And then the professor said, okay, what's the logarithm of AB? And the answer would be the log of A plus the log of B. But what that really did was it turned it into growth rates. So when you look at this, it's almost like taking the logarithms of the equation of exchange or the quantity equation. Why is this important? Because what it's really saying to you in very simple terms is what happens on the left side of the equation must happen to the right side of the equation. And the left side is saying take that growth of the money supply and take the growth of velocity. And that's going to equal the growth of the price index plus the growth of real GDP. In other words, let's make a very, very, very simple assumption, okay? Let's assume that there's no change in velocity. So G bar V is 0. The left side of the equation is the growth of the money supply. And what that would be telling you is if you increase the money supply and nothing happens to velocity, it stays with no growth. Growth of velocity is 0. And you increase the money supply, the result is going to be some movement in the price index, the growth of P, and some movement in real income. So that growth in the money supply would be affecting prices and real income or real GDP. But that would be the case in the long run. In the short run, we can't really do much to real GDP. We can't change the quantity and quality of the labor force. We can't change resources. We can't change management skills. So what often happens is that people look at this equation and they go, G bar M, or growth in the money supply, in the short run results in changes in inflation, because you can't really change Y in the short run because you can't change the quantity and quality of your labor force and the quantity and quality of your capital. But what you can change is the price index. And that's why now that the money supply in 2021 has been growing so fast, and it's going to grow even faster once the stimulus bill is finally passed, which may be today, and the money gets out into the hands of the public, and they spend that money, and that money ends up in bank accounts, and the banks then lend that money out, and you get credit growth and all of that. There are those who are starting to worry that we may get more inflation. So I thought it was important for you to realize that if you see MV equals PY, well, if you took the logarithms of that, it would be the log of M plus the log of V equals the log of P plus the log of Y, which are growth rates in effect, not quite mathematically, but virtually growth rates. And then you really have something you can latch onto. If you know what the money supply is growing at, you know that it's going to be manifested on the right side of the equation in something that happens to inflation and something that happens to real growth. And I wanted to make sure that I emphasize that for you, that you get a sense of where the thinking is about that and where the thinking is about that in 2021. So I think that's an important point. Okay. Again, if you have any questions about any of that, please let me know. Okay, toward the end of the class, we talked about the Fisher equation. I cannot emphasize enough for you how important the Fisher equation is. So much of what we will be discussing for the remainder of the semester will be playing out not just in the real economy, but also in the financial sector or in the financial system. And of course, that's where interest rates come into play, because that's where borrowing and lending takes place, and that's where people get paid for giving up their liquidity. You know, your bank gives you interest on your money in the bank because you're giving up your liquidity temporarily, and you want to be compensated for that. And we talked about the R, and we said R really is what I would be, what the nominal interest rate would be in a world with no inflation expectation, because I would be equal to R plus 0, not R plus pi. And of course, a lot of things have to factor into what the interest rates are. Lenders want to make a profit, but lenders are also taking risks. They're taking a risk of default, that you may not pay back, that you may pay back partially, you may pay back late. They're taking a risk that maybe the interest rate they're charging you is the wrong interest rate. They're taking a risk that maybe inflation will go up during the time of this loan. I mean, look at all the people who are taking out mortgages now at what are now just a little bit higher than what were record low mortgage interest rates, locking them in for 30 years, and the banks are stuck with those. They lent you that money for 30 years at rock bottom levels. What happens if interest rates shoot up and they have to start paying people for their CDs, much higher interest rates? Their asset, which is the mortgage, is paying the bank a little bit, and what they're paying depositors at the bank may be a lot more. Well, if your liabilities are stronger than or bigger than your assets, that's not a good way to run a bank. So it could be that maybe there's the risk that you charge the wrong interest rate. And then we know that there are political risks and people want to be compensated for that. We know that there's a risk that maybe the economy will be stronger than anticipated. So maybe demand for credit will be really accelerating relative to the supply of liquidity in the system. That would force up interest rates. All of that's got to be embedded in the R. And yet, for so many months in the United States, R has been negative. Let me repeat that. R has been negative, meaning banks effectively or lenders effectively weren't getting paid terribly much for the risk that they were taking. In fact, they were getting paid negatively for the risks they were taking. Well, that forces us to take a look at this entire equation, because that pi sign that you see is sitting out there. And we need to take a look at what goes into that pi, into that inflation expectation. So first, before we really dig into that, let's just take a look at a couple of the points that are made here. Okay, so let's start at the bottom. The expected rate of inflation isn't constant, as we know, and it depends upon models and estimates of individual borrowers and lenders. So your expected inflation rate may be different from mine, which is obvious because we may be using different models. We'll talk about those models in 1 minute. Many borrowers and lenders rely on estimates by economists in the private sector, at the Fed, or the government. Something to keep aware of. We watch that carefully. So we talk about the Fisher effect, and we look at interest rates relative to that, to the actual inflation rate, and you can see that sometimes interest rates can come tumbling down just because the inflation rate has come tumbling down. But what's really important here is it's conceivable, and it has happened, that the real interest rate can fall into negative territory. So let's take a look at that by focusing on the right side of that equation, by taking a look at pi, by taking a look at expected inflation. How do we come up with inflation expectations? Now, at any moment in time, you and I will have an inflation expectation. We may not think of it. You may say, I don't know, I didn't go to bed last night thinking about what's inflation going to be next year. I've never given any thought to that. Well, you may not have actually given any thought to it, but you know it's implicit in your thinking. because you may be thinking, if you have a job, about how much are you going to be paid next year? Are you going to get a raise? And you know that you want that raise to be bigger than whatever the inflation rate is so that you can have a real gain, so that your real income can be going up, your inflation adjusted income. So you have to do that. And we know from surveys by the University of Michigan's Consumer Research Center, by an organization called the Conference Board, who go out and they ask thousands of individuals just like you, do you have an inflation expectation? And if so, what is it? And it's really interesting to see that the inflation expectations are generally in the ballpark of what actually transpires. Usually, you and I have an inflation expectation that's higher than what the reality is in the measured numbers. And that's because the things that you and I might buy are different from the 80,000 things that may go into a price index, or more if you're looking at the PCE deflator. Because what do we buy? We buy housing, which is a disproportionate share of the money that we spend in a month. We buy education. We buy medical care. Notice 3 services right up front. We buy transportation, another service. And yeah, we actually buy some food. But you know what? A lot of the food that we buy is actually considered a service because we buy it in a restaurant. So if you go into a McDonald's on the way to school, and maybe you get, an Egg McMuffin and a cup of coffee, that's actually considered a service because it was served to you. The point being, we all have inflation expectations. But when we start to look at how those get built into interest rates through that Fisher equation, and I can't emphasize enough how important it is for you to understand that slide on the Fisher equation and what we're doing right now. This slide is immensely important. Hint, hint, hint. So let's take a look at that. It starts out like right now. I mentioned on Monday that the price of lumber is adding something of the order of about $4,700 to the price of a new house being built today compared to where it was just a few months ago. Lumber prices have just shot up because a lot of people are leaving cities and they're moving to suburbs, and they're finding lots and they're building on those lots. They're getting out of the city. And a lot of those are young people. And so demand for lumber has been extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. But consistent with that, you're seeing that happen to the price of copper, because let's face it, the plumbing inside of a home has quite a bit of copper. Inside your shower, inside that wall is a copper tube. So we've seen that with a lot of different commodities that have gone up, and a lot of people look at commodity prices and they see that as a leading indicator. Remember, we talked about leading, coincident, and lagging indicators as a leading indicator of inflation. Because let's face it, if the price of materials like copper and lumber is going up, wouldn't you expect to see that in the PCE deflator? Wouldn't you expect to see that in the GDP, implicit price deflator, or in the consumer price index? Yeah, it appears. And now we know that the price of oil has gone up, and a barrel of oil that just a few months ago was barely $40 is now $67 or $68 a barrel, headed higher. And so the price of a gallon of gasoline is up by close to 40 cents from where it was before, and that's a lot. If you're buying 10 gallons of gasoline, only 10, that's an extra $4 that you're paying. So that's significant. People look at that and they go, well, yeah, that must mean that inflation is headed higher. But one thing we know about commodity prices is that they can be a leading indicator of inflation, but they typically aren't. And the reason is that these moves in commodity prices tend to be exogenous, and they tend to be temporary. They come from outside of the economic system. It doesn't have to do with the normal interaction between a worker and an employer so that wages went up. The contract that Dak Prescott signed with the Dallas Cowboys yesterday or 2 days ago is endogenous. That's from within the system. But the price of oil going up just has to do with decisions being made by the Saudis and the Russians and other members of OPEC as well as some US and British oil companies, but it's temporary. Now, it can become permanent. I mean, if that price of oil goes up and stays up there, and then because it stayed up there, people start asking for higher wages than they would have otherwise, then it becomes endogenous, N-E-N, from within the system. But normally we don't look at commodity prices as being something that causes a sustained increase in the inflation rate. But most models have a particular point of view. And the particular point of view is, well, inflation doesn't come from cost push, really, like commodity prices going up. It's really all demand pull. And what exactly is demand pull? I hope you studied this in Economics 101, but if you didn't, demand pull inflation comes about when, for whatever reasons, the growth of aggregate spending power on a sustained basis, I don't mean for 1 month or 2 months, I mean it just keeps growing and growing and growing. When the growth of aggregate spending power, in other words, demand, goes on for months and months at a rate that's faster than the growth in aggregate supply, so that you've got demand growing on a sustained basis faster than the growth in supply, you're going to get higher prices. It just means, in terms of, again, Economics 101 terms, your demand curve shifted to the right more than your supply curve shifted to the right. So you have a new equilibrium at a higher price level. That's demand pull inflation. So what's important here is this push and pull between that which creates aggregate spending power, its growth rate, versus the growth rate of aggregate supply. And in the end, the growth of aggregate supply depends upon productivity growth and the growth in the labor force, or the growth in hours worked. And I guess if you really wanted to, you could talk about the growth of imports. So with that in mind, most economists I know tend to think about building inflation expectations with 3 models. Those are the 3 bullet points that you see on this page. The first one is consistent with the work that I alluded to twice already in 2 different classes that I did in the 1970s with my co-author, Peter Berman, where we looked at growth rates in the money supply over a 2.5-year period. And we said, you know what? The amount by which the money supply went up over each of the last 10 quarters, minus the rate of productivity growth, will give you a pretty good forecast of the inflation rate. So think about that. What does money do? Money gives you the power to spend it. I mean, what do you do with money? You either spend it or you don't. So money in your hands gives you transactions motive, gives you the ability to spend. What does the productivity that I talked about do? Productivity gives you output. You know, look at it. Product. That's the root of the word. It's giving you supply. So money supply gives you the potential for demand. Productivity gives you the potential for supply. So by looking at sustained, persistent, and unreversed, meaning it goes up and up and up, it doesn't go up and then down again, and then up again, down again. No. It goes up and up and up. That's what unreversed means. Growth in the money supply at a rate that's faster than the growth of productivity. In other words, you get persistent growth in the ability of households, businesses, and governments to buy at a rate faster than the growth of productivity, which brings goods and services to market supply. You're going to get inflation. So that's one thing we watch. Secondly, we look at sustained growth in unit labor costs. Same concept of demand and supply, but seen in a different way. So what is growth in unit labor costs? Growth in unit labor costs is the difference between the growth in labor compensation, wages and benefits, versus labor compensation. But think about it, the model is the same. What do wages do for you? It gives you the ability to buy. It gives you demand. And what does labor productivity do? It provides goods and services to the market. That's supply. So if you've got unit labor costs that are rising, it means that compensation is growing faster than productivity. It means that demand is growing faster than potential supply. Bam, you're going to get inflation. The demand curve shifted to the right more than the supply curve shifted to the right. Now, I work for a German company, and my colleagues in Frankfurt put, in their mind, they put the greatest weight on the third bullet point. This is something that Europeans look at, I think, a little bit more maybe than many US economists, although US economists do look at this. And what they're looking at is the gap between actual growth in real GDP versus potential or sustained growth in GDP. That spread between those two growth rates. So why is that? So effectively what they're saying is, look at the growth in actual GDP. Well, what is that? It's national income, right? Look at the growth in national income, the actual growth in national income. That's what GDP is. What does income give you? The ability to buy. It gives you demand. Versus growth in the sustainable or potential growth rate, which is productivity growth plus growth in the labor force. That gives you supply. To the extent that actual GDP continues to grow at a rate faster than sustainable or potential growth in GDP, you're going to get inflation. Because you're going to be expanding national income, national spending power at a rate faster than your ability to, on a sustained basis, bring goods and services to the market, which is your potential growth rate. That is a very European point of view, but again, I have to tell you, I don't know of an economist in the US who doesn't look at that. All I'm saying is that the Europeans would put that as the first bullet point. So here are three very different ways of coming up with an inflation expectation, but there's this common thread that you're looking at potential buying power or potential demand on the left hand, and then on the right hand, you're looking at the potential to generate supply with the right hand. And when you get a situation where demand potentially or actually is growing faster than supply, you're going to get inflation. These are the basic models that build into inflation expectations. So one of the things that has happened, and the reason why we have had negative real yields, is that the actual interest rate, I equals R plus pi, the I has been so low. The I has been so low really because the Fed has forced it down towards zero. So if you have any kind of inflation expectation, you know, I equals R plus inflation expectation, it means basically the R has to be negative. So if the I, let's say, is 1%, and inflation expectation, let's say hypothetically, is 3%, then real interest rate has to be -2. And that's effectively what's happened. The sustained really low interest rates have resulted in us having negative real rates. Now, what's happening is that those real rates are starting to rise because there's an expectation in the marketplace that the economy is getting stronger, that the demand for credit is going to be picking up. And there's an expectation in the market that with the big amount of debt coming from the Treasury because of the stimulus packages, all the Treasury securities they're putting out on the market, that what's going to happen is the price of Treasuries is going to fall, which means their yields are going to go up. So we're looking at all of this, and we're trying to get our arms around it, at least the market is. And it seems to vary every single day. Yesterday, the inflation expectations were lower, and you saw the technology stocks have one of their best days ever. Today, everybody's not so sure, and the technology stocks are sort of wavering again. Finally, how do we get different kinds of inflation expectations? You can get them from the marketplace, or you can get them from surveys. We have inflation protected securities, or TIPS, and built into those TIPS is what's called an inflation premium. I'm not going to go into the mechanics of that for you, at least not here. And you can get that. And that's telling you effectively what the market thinks, because the market will determine the size of that inflation premium. But you could also do surveys. The Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank does a survey of economists, and it asks them, what do you think the inflation rate is going to be over the next year? Literally asks them, and then publishes it. The Federal Reserve itself, every second meeting, comes out with, its economic projections, and the Fed will tell you what it thinks inflation will be. So all of that information is out there in the media, in the markets, from consumer behavior, from surveys, from investor behavior, determining interest rates, determining what that pie is. All of this gives us a sense of what inflation expectations will be. And we cover all of this because that Fisher equation is so critical to us, because it has that real rate and it has an inflation expectation, and it gives us the best sense of how we could determine where interest rates are going. And since it is the job of the Federal Reserve to give us maximum employment and price stability, and they do that by manipulating interest rates, we've closed the circle. The importance, I think, should become pretty obvious. I'll stop there and ask if you have any questions. Okay. So why do we care? When the effects of inflation are greater than expected. Now, this is all stuff that you could read on your own. I don't think there's terribly much in here that requires terribly much explanation. But there are a couple of things here I want to point out to you. When inflation is greater than expected, you're going to see a redistribution of both income and wealth. If you are somebody, let's say a dentist, you have the ability to set your own prices. You may be buying materials for your dental practice, and those materials went up in price. So you know what you do? You increase the fee that you charge for cleaning or to fill the cavity or to do a root canal. You just do that because you are a price maker. You and I go to the dentist. We are price takers, so we lose out in the end. So if you have the ability to set a price, a lawyer who sets his or her fee for an hour's worth of legal advice or legal action, a doctor or dentist, a consultant, if you can make your price, you're going to benefit from inflation. Now, there are certain industries that also benefit. Excuse me one second. I'm so sorry. There are certain industries that need to benefit. Let's face it, they have very low income and price elasticities of demand. So if the price goes up, they're actually better off. I mean, really, that's pretty much what you see, say, with gasoline. People don't change their driving patterns because the price of gasoline went up by 10 cents or 40 cents as it has recently. They don't. But what does happen is the gas station ends up making more money. So here's the point. That's a redistribution of wealth. And we see that redistribution of wealth occur in exactly that way. And another thing that happens is that oftentimes that plays out in the stock market, because there are companies that will do better when prices go up. And if there are people who can invest in the stock market in those companies, they're going to do really well. And that too is going to change the distribution of income and wealth. So there are a lot of different things that go on when inflation is greater than expected. I'm going to ask you, I'm glad we're recording this, I'm going to ask you seriously to look at each of these 7 bullet points carefully, read them, get them into the left side of your brain, get them into your heart. You'll see these, you're going to see these on your next exam. That's not what's important. Try to understand why we pay so much attention to inflation. It's right here in words, and this is not complicated stuff. So we'll just leave it at that. Okay. So inflation really is a kind of a tax, And what inflation does, as we know, is that it takes your standard of living and reduces it. Every dollar in your pocket, every dollar in any of your accounts just buys less today than it did yesterday. That hurts. I mean, when you think about it, every time your landlord raises your rent and you pay that increase, you're saying to yourself, I worked hard for that money. I don't want to give that money to the landlord. I mean, I'm not getting anything better from the landlord. It's the same apartment. It's hopefully the same um, elevator that takes me up to the ninth floor or whatever, or the same staircase that I walk up to. I'm not getting anything more, but yet I'm paying this guy more. Well, yeah, I mean, the landlord faces higher taxes, higher water bills, higher electricity bills, higher maintenance bills. The doorman, if there's a doorman, wants to get paid more. The super in the building wants to get paid more. Yeah, you have to do that. But every time you have to do it, it hurts you because you say, I don't know, I didn't get a raise, but I still have to pay more rent. And I don't feel like I'm getting any more for my money. And it hurts. And it reduces your standard of living. It just does. But if it gets really, really high, it being the inflation rate, it hurts you really a lot. And so we try to keep price stability as a goal for the Fed and really as the goal for government in general because it hurts people really badly.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
How do employees adjust for inflation? Like, let's say they get a raise, but they realize it's not really a raise. Like, would they talk to their employer?
Oh, Famia, that's an impossible question to answer in this sense because it depends on whether and to what extent you have any power in the organization where you work. Let me give you an example. Suppose you're represented by a union. So let's say you're a New York City elementary school teacher, which maybe some of you will become. I minored in education. I wanted to be a high school teacher. You're represented by your union, and you would hope that when your union contract comes up, your union reps who are negotiating with the Department of Education, let's just say the city of New York, account for that and somehow can extract a bigger pay increase for you because the inflation was there. That's one case. Let's take a case which is very extreme. You are really, really a star, uniquely a star, like an athlete or a performer. Well, what you do is you say, either you pay me what I need or I'm out of here. So maybe I won't do that movie. You want me to star in that movie. I'm not going to do it. You go get some other actor. I'm not doing it because you have that power. Or you're the quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys and you say, either you give me the money or I'm not playing. And so you get a $66 million signing bonus and $180 million, $160 million over 4 years, $75 million to play in the year 2021. And why do you get that? Because you have that kind of power. But let's turn to the other extreme. You're just an individual employee. You're not unionized. You're working in some facility of some sort. It could be a small store or it could be who knows where. What are you supposed to do? You're working and you're not unionized and your boss says, hey, guess what? Giving you a 2% raise and you're expected to put a big smile on your face and say, oh, thank you so much. And yeah, you give me 2%, but inflation's more than 2%. What are you going to do? And the answer is effectively, unless you have some sort of power, there isn't much you're really going to be able to do. I mean, I don't really, Famia, I don't really know a better way to answer that question. It depends a lot upon your market power. And it's tough because most of us don't have any.
Okay, so it's not naturally accounted for. Then you have to fight for it, then, right?
I would say that, yeah, I guess that's what I would say. Most of us, I mean, I think of in my career, I mean, even if I think about the last couple of years, we got our pay increases. We got our pay increases in January, effective February 1st. And what would happen is I would have a performance review with my boss, and he would sit me down and he'd say, in light of that, Steve, we're projecting to give you a base salary in, whatever year it was of X dollars. And if I opened up my mouth and said, X dollars, that's ridiculous. I deserve Y dollars. He would say, yeah, but that's all the money that I've been budgeted. I don't have any more money to give you, Steve. That's it. Take it or leave it. That's about it. I mean, and at Queens College, where I am represented by frankly, a very weak union. I mean, we've gone periods, 5 years, 6 years, well, not 6, but we've gone periods of 5 years with no pay increase at all. None. My wife is a senior attorney for the Federal Trade Commission, U.S. government. I know you're going to find this hard to believe, but this is the gospel truth. She went there in 1990, 30 years ago, and has not had a raise since. Now, there have been cost of living adjustments, meaning they gave everybody more money consistent with the increase in the consumer price index. But in real terms, nothing, because she was at the most senior level and the government did not expand the top of that pay grade, senior attorney. So what a senior attorney was paid in 1990 is what a senior attorney is being paid in 2021, with the exception of increases due to the consumer price index. No real increases at all. What does that say? The union that she is in, negotiating against the federal government, just has not been able to make any headway. So it's a complicated issue how you get pay increases. So,
Okay, I got it.
okay, thank you for your question. Just a few things, because I want to end in 4 minutes and get to the other issues of the day. Monetizing the debt. When the government pays off its debts by printing money, well, as we sit here in 2021, that's pretty much what's going on. It has not been tried successfully in terribly many places. It has failed in many places, and yet that's pretty much what's going on. To think that we could spend, between the various stimulus packages, close to $3 trillion and do it by issuing debt. And if you're issuing debt, it means there has to be liquidity in the market, and that liquidity is being provided by the Fed. To think that you could do that and that there'll be no ramifications down the line, M bar plus V bar equals P bar plus Q plus Y bar, that sooner or later that the left side with the M going up isn't going to be manifested in the P and the Y going up, not just the Y, but the P and the Y. I don't know. I find that hard to believe. So we try not to monetize the debt. Most years we don't do it. We're in an era now where that's actually what's going on. Sometimes financial intermediation breaks down. Intermediation means the actual use of the financial system. And we had a circumstance roughly 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I'm sorry, where people were actually taking money out of the banking system. And the reason they were taking money out of the banking system was the banks were paying on deposits way less than what people were getting by buying other types of financial assets. So money was coming out of the banking system and going into other types of financial assets, and we had what's called disintermediation. That's really hard on the banks, because if there's no money in the banks, their supply, their raw material for making loans has shrunken, and that supply, and if supply is shrinking relative to demand, it means that prices have to go up. Interest rates became sky high. The demand for credit collapsed, and the economy went into a deep recession. So we watch that very carefully. I'm going to stop here. There are just a few more things related to inflation that we'll get to on Monday, and then we'll dive right into the IS curve, which is complicated for those of you, and there are some of you, and I thank you for that, who've done the homework. It's complicated. We only need to spend a few minutes more on inflation. So what I want to be sure you take out of our class today, I want you to be sure that you go to bls.gov and look at the CPI report that came out today, just so you could see it. read a little bit about how they put it together, which is in the report. Number two, to remember that there are different measures of inflation that we use, that the consumer price index is just one of them, but we also look at the PCE deflator and the deflator for the GDP itself, for the entire GDP. Start over again. We look at the deflator for personal consumption expenditures, which is the favored one by the Fed. And we also look at the deflator for the GDP, but we do it for all items, and we do it for the core, where the core takes out inflation in goods and inflation in energy. I want you to pay attention to that MV equals PY, and remember that growth of the money supply plus growth of velocity, that's the left side or the spending side, is going to equal growth in the price index, which is inflation, plus growth in real GDP, which together equals nominal GDP. And so if you see something on the left side, like growth in the money supply, if you assume velocity doesn't change, so the only variable that changed was the money supply, you have to have changes on the right side of the equation. Something had to happen to the price index, or inflation, and something had to happen to real GDP. So that's the next thing you want to keep in mind. You want to keep in mind the Fisher equation, which is nominal interest rates equal the real rate plus an inflation expectation. And the inflation expectations come about from various different sources. We talked about 3 different models, but we also mentioned that sometimes you can get inflation expectation information from what's happening in the marketplace, like the premium on TIPS, Treasury inflation protected securities, but also from surveys like the Philadelphia Fed Survey of Economists, or what's being said by officials at the Federal Reserve. All of these things help us to get an inflation expectation. And sometimes it could very well be that the real interest rate falls into negative territory, as it has been recently, because the nominal interest rate is too low relative to the inflation expectation. And we've talked about a number of different things about the impacts of inflation. When inflation is too high, that it redistributes income and wealth, among other things, that it helps price makers but not the price takers. And I guess those are the main most important points of our class today. So I'll stop with that, and let's turn the page figuratively to your exam. We started to go over some of the questions. I didn't think it was terribly productive to go, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, but there may be a couple of them where you didn't understand the answer or you disputed the answer. I'm not sure I would know where they would be, but maybe there's 1 or 2 of those that you want to highlight. Well, silence is golden, but it's not necessary. But I don't want it to be fool's gold. So listen, you have the questions, you have the answers. Let me recommend to you that you go through the exam over the weekend, look at the answers, and there might be a couple of them that make you scratch your head and say, why did he give C as the answer? I think it should have been B. Okay? Fine. Yep.
We ask
Go
the
ahead.
questions if we have questions we could ask now, or
Yeah.
all right. Can I ask about number 15?
Number 15. Okay.
Yeah, you said the answer was.
Hold on a second. Hold on a second, Brian. Let me just turn my page. 15. According to standard growth models, I said countries that devote a relatively larger share of their output to investment will be wealthier. Okay. And you dispute that?
Yeah, I don't dispute that, but on the slide where it says that in the chapters 4 and 5 slide, it also says new ideas are the driving force behind long-run economic growth. It says both answers. So D.
Yeah. Okay. Score 1 for you, Brian. You're absolutely right. I will make note of that. And what I will do is I will just add 3 points to everybody's score. I'll just assume everyone got it wrong. I don't know. I'll just add 3 points to everyone's score. Ladies and gentlemen, you owe Brian 3 points. Nice going, Brian. That's actually very, very perceptive. I thank you for correcting me, and that's very good. Thank you so much.
All right, can I also, sorry, one more. Could I ask about number 33?
33. Okay. So this reads, for those of you who don't have the questions in front of you, the share of the civilian population age 16 and above that is working or out of work and seeking employment best defines what?
I said the labor force, and you, that would be A, and you said the labor force participation rate.
Yeah, that's what it is. You got the numerator. It says the share of the population, not the number of people, the share of the population. So obviously it has to be a fraction. So you got the numerator of the fraction, you didn't get the whole fraction. So the whole fraction would be the labor force participation rate, C. Your question raises an important point, and I apologize because I know that when I started to say this kind of stuff on Monday, it irritated some of you. So I apologize ahead of time. I'm not trying to irritate anybody. These are definitions, and my feeling is that a question like this probably shouldn't have taken more than 15 seconds to do. I mean, you either know what the labor force participation rate is or you don't. And no matter how much you might sit there and ponder it and pull the hair out of your head, you either know this or you don't. So a question like number 33, I would look at that and I go, that's the definition of the labor force participation rate. See, that's how I think of questions like this. Some of them do require some thinking or analysis. This is not one of them. And so I think this test was replete with at least half the test where I would look at that and say, if I had studied hard, if I had done my work, I would know the answer to this instantaneously. Somebody made the comment on Monday and said, yeah, I mean, someone wrote actually and said, yeah, if you've been doing this your whole life, it's easy, but not for those of us who are learning it. Well, guess what? By the time you take a test, you should have learned it. It shouldn't be something you have to think about. It should be natural already. That's what study is about. But I would also say it's a first exam, ladies and gentlemen. I don't care where you are in the second inning of the game. And you shouldn't care terribly much where you are in the second inning of the game. But if it gets to be May 22nd when your final exam is, and you don't know what the labor force participation rate is, that's pretty serious. Not knowing what the labor force participation rate is on March 10th is disappointing, but it's not tragic. But how would I, in good conscience, give an A to a student who at the end of May doesn't know what the labor force participation rate is in a macro class? That would be absurd. So don't worry about where you are now. Who's great at anything in the very beginning of it? You're in the very beginning of this stuff. Relax, learn it. Which just leads to one last point. I'm sorry for dominating the talking, because I want to do the homework, and we'll get to that right now. Repeatedly, I've said to my wonderful friends in this class, the way to learn this stuff is 20 minutes a day, 6 days a week. Not to study for an exam, 3 or 4 hours before the exam happens or the night before. If you look at these PowerPoint presentations for 10 or 15 minutes, 6 days a week, oh my goodness, it becomes so totally natural, you wouldn't even have to think about anything. I call it the drip method of learning, as opposed to people who say, you can't get a good drink of water out of a fire hose. When you wait to the end, it's trying to drink out of a fire hose. When you do this drip by drip by drip, a little bit every single day, 15 minutes, just scroll through them. It becomes so natural. Somebody asked about number 38. Wages tend to change more slowly and less frequently than real GDP and the rate of inflation. This finding is consistent with the concept of wage rigidity. Now, I have to admit that this is not a point where I spent hours and hours talking with you about it. It's a point I made and emphasized, and then we sort of moved on from it. It is the definition of wage rigidity. And if you didn't get it right, okay, you didn't get it right. I mean, it's not one of the real critical points. But you know what? One of the purposes of giving an exam is to separate the girls from the women and the boys from the men, because what happens is you get a grade distribution. In your class, the grade distribution wasn't so great. In my CCNY class, I had people who got 100. I had people who got 91. I had several 91s. I had a couple of 88s. And I had somebody who, out of 33 questions, got 3 right. Man, that's exactly the grade distribution you hope for, because now I know how to grade people. I can think about grading. If that happens again on the final exam, it becomes easy. I know who gets an A and I know who gets an F. So sometimes you ask questions to really see who got into the weeds and really mastered it. If you got this one wrong, you got it wrong. My emphasis for you is work constantly, but don't work like a maniac. I'm not saying you should work 2 hours a day, 6 days a week on this stuff. I'm saying do 15 minutes 6 days a week. And when you do, you're going to find that this stuff becomes so natural to you that you're going to be terrific. Number 36. A technician working for Con Ed to cut down tree limbs leaning on electric power lines falls to the ground from a height of 30 feet and becomes permanently disabled. The technician's lawyer must calculate the technician's lost future earnings. To do so, the lawyer has to calculate the present discounted value of the technician's future earnings. We went through this in some detail. We talked about how you calculate. I showed you the equations, asked you to play with them, asked you to, there was an example there, and I said, verify that these numbers are correct. And I even told you that I did it to make sure that the textbook was correct. So we talked about how you have to look at the discounted future value of earnings. What's important here is, you have to be able, in looking at wages and looking at what might be lost in this particular case, you have to realize that it's going to be dependent upon the discount rate that you use. And the discount rate typically is an inflation rate. And that oftentimes lawyers are asked to go into court, and they will typically bring an economist with them to do this, to calculate this number and say, okay, a guy fell out while cutting down tree limbs, is now permanently disabled. I'm suing for lifetime earnings. How do you figure out how much this person is worth? We went through this in some detail. And you can go back into the work that we did and look at the equations that I gave to you. Because again, I know I told you to recalculate the equations. Oh, I'm sorry, the result of the example that was there to verify that it was true. But the concept here is that when you look into the future, you have to discount the value of something, because either you're going to get inflation, or you have to look at what it might have earned if the employee in this case did not get injured, but the inflation rate were X%. How much would the earnings be worth in the future? Because let's face it, some of the money that the employee would have earned would have gotten saved. And if it was saved, it would have earned interest. You have to account for that. This is work that we did in class, and it was work that's, again, it's actually in the PowerPoint presentation. And more importantly, too, it's also in the textbook. So what's important here is that you're looking at the discounted future value of the employer's earnings. Number 26, somebody just asked about. Now again, this is strictly a definition, and you can't get out of this course. I can't in good conscience give a passing grade in May. I'm not concerned about what you did in March, but I can't give a passing grade in May to any student who would get this question wrong. It's just flat out that. Workers whose job loss is attributable mainly to unfavorable business or economic conditions are called, what are they called? Cyclically unemployed. We talked about cyclical unemployment. We talked about structural unemployment. We talked about frictional unemployment. The definitions were presented to you. We discussed them in detail. We talked about how there is a natural rate of unemployment, which is structural plus frictional, below which we would really never expect to get. And in the US, we think that's around 3% measured on a U3 basis. But if you lost your job because the economy stunk, you are cyclically unemployed. And I made the point that we can eliminate cyclical unemployment theoretically if the economy is really going great. And I pointed out to you that in the final year of the Trump administration, and I'm not attributing this to Trump by any means, so I'm not making a political statement. You will never know where I stand politically. But in the final year of the Trump administration, we pretty much got the cyclical unemployment rate down to zero. Almost all the unemployment that we had was either structural or frictional. So when the economy is not doing well, you have cyclical unemployment. It sort of reminds me of one time when I worked at the Federal Reserve. I went out to lunch. It was a beautiful day, and I was walking in the street, and there was a young lady standing in front of a jewelry store in Lower Manhattan, and she had these little green pieces of paper. And she handed me one, and all it said was, "We're having a business stinks sale." A business stinks sale. What she's really saying is that we're cutting prices on a cyclical basis. If you lose your job because your firm is not doing well, because the economy is not doing well, you are cyclically unemployed. Frictional unemployment would come about if you're entering the labor force or re-entering the labor force, or say you're between jobs. Let's just say you hate the job you have. I just can't work there anymore. I'm out of here. I just hate it here. And I'll quit. And while it's just easier for me to look for a job when I'm out of work, making appointments for job interviews and all of that is easier. So you're in the labor force because you're out of work and seeking employment, but you're out of work not because the economy stinks, not because you don't have the skill set, not because jobs are in another part of the country and you can't go there, not because of communication issues, like you have no idea where there are jobs out there, so you're unemployed. No, you're out of work really kind of by choice. Those are all frictional unemployment. That's frictional. Structural says pretty much what I just did. There are jobs that I qualify for, but not in my town, and I can't move where those jobs are. Or I know there are jobs out there, I just don't know where they are. Somehow, whatever app I'm using or websites I go to, it looks like there's no jobs out there, but yet I know they are. They're out there, I just don't know where they are. That's a communication issue. But maybe more importantly, the skill set that I have, or my physical condition, or frankly, it could be your age, which would be discriminatory, but it could be your age, says, you know what? There's no match between who I am and the jobs that are out there. They're only hiring younger people. They're only hiring people who are really proficient in Excel, but I don't know anything about Excel, so I can't apply for that job. They're only hiring people who are mathematically sophisticated. But, in high school, I got a 75 in math, so it isn't me. I'm not a quant guy. That's structural unemployment. This question is strictly dealing with cyclical unemployment. I have a skill set. I'm really good at what I do. But my business has to let me go because business just stinks. I'm really a terrific waiter in an Italian restaurant on, 3rd Avenue and, 96th Street. I'm a terrific waiter, but the restaurant's been closed because of COVID and there's no customers, so they had to let me go. That's cyclical unemployment. Someone just asked if exams are cumulative. You better believe it, they are, because that goes right back to my whole philosophy of repetition, repetition, repetition. The more I ask you to continue to focus on the same material over and over and over again, the more it's going to sink in. And then the more you do that on your own time, 15 minutes, 5, 6 days a week, the more that repetition is, the more you're going to take that final exam and get a really high grade. So yes, exams are cumulative. So what I'd like to do in the few minutes we have left is just take a few minutes to look at some of the homework questions I gave you pertaining to inflation. And here's where I would really be grateful if you would chime in with your answers. I mean, obviously I know the answers, so what's the point of that? The way you're going to learn is by being able to articulate it. So why is price stability so important? Why are inflation expectations important? So let's start with that. Why do we want price stability? Why do we want prices to be going up at 2% a year, but we don't want them going up at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% a year and then dropping down? You want them to go up at a slow and steady pace, but you want them to be going up. That's price stability. Why is that important?
So the government can anticipate the rate and adjust incomes and incomes accordingly, and people don't suddenly have no means to buy things because the inflation rate went up so drastically.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do, when you talk about stability, a lot of it has to do with being able to anchor, as you said, to be able to anticipate. So all employers, it's not just the government in terms of government workers, it's really all employers to be able to figure out how much to pay their workers. But it does the same thing for each of us. We can anticipate what something's going to cost. Because let's face it, if we didn't have price stability and you're not living in a rent stabilized apartment, God only knows what your rent is going to be next year if the inflation rate, were to shoot up. Let me be extreme. It would cause chaos. Exactly. Who knows what your rent would be next year? Let's say if the inflation rate were 10%. As it is, you're paying $1,500 a month for your apartment, and then your landlord goes, "Okay, I'm raising your rent to $2,000 a month," and you go, "I can't pay $2,000 a month." It would destroy people. So you want to be able to anchor in that so that you could plan. You can make decisions. And that's why inflation expectations, that's the second half of the question, is so important. So that you can anticipate and plan and make judgments as to, if you think next year there's going to be much more inflation, maybe this year you want to save a little bit more money so you could pay your bills next year. Maybe you want to increase your savings rate now so you could pay your bills next year because those bills are going to be more expensive. That's what planning is about. What's the best, most up-to-date thinking among economists about the relationship between between inflation and growth in the money supply? This comes right out of what we did today and on Monday. Remember the 4 hedges? Remember, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. I said, but we have new thinking on that. Nobody. This is hugely important. You'll see it on your exams. The
I believe,
relationship. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I think it's that they're correlated in a way where if one increases, so does the other. So I guess real output in that case can help determine the prices of goods and services while accounting for inflation. So if the money supply surpasses, then if that can affect I'm sorry. So I guess if the money supply surpasses like the rate an economy produces goods and services, inflation can rise as a result.
Yeah, I mean that is certainly I don't know how to say this. That's certainly an appropriate answer. Not the one I was shooting for, but you know, but I would give you full credit on an exam for that. But it's not where I'm going. Yeah, whoever just wrote that last caption about unknown and long term, whoever that is, want to say something? Well, somebody just wrote that the relationship between money supply and inflation is long term. It's highly uncertain. We know that too much money supply growth, but we don't know how to define that or quantify that. for too long, we don't know how long a time period that is, will result eventually, when is that, in too much inflation. And how much is too much inflation? We don't really know how to quantify that either. All that in the context of a highly variable, long-term, and very uncertain relationship. Putting that all together, look at the terms we're using. Long-term, highly uncertain, very variable, and very variable because too much money supply growth, well, what's too much today may not have been too much in 1990 or 2000 or 2010. Too much money supply growth for too long. How long is too long? We don't really know. It depends on all kinds of other circumstances. Will result eventually. Does that mean 3 months from now, 6 months from now, next year, 2 years from now? We don't know. In too much inflation, will the inflation rate go from 2 to 3%? Will it go to 2 to 5%? Will it go from 2 to 10%? Uncertain. Very, very important for you to master these concepts of this highly uncertain, highly variable, long-term. Those are terms that, say, you use with your left hand, and with your right hand. Too much money supply growth for too long results eventually in too much inflation. 4 parts, 4 hedges. That's where I was going. The answer we just got really answers question number 3. To what extent is inflation caused by and sustained by growth in aggregate spending power at a rate faster than growth in aggregate supply? The answer we just got from your classmate actually just answered that. When you have growth in aggregate spending power at a rate that is faster than growth in aggregate supply persistently and not reversed, you end up with more inflation. List of steps that the Fed has taken over the past decade in order to increase the growth rate of PCE deflator. Why have these actions been unable so far to bring the inflation rate to 2%? Anybody, ladies and gentlemen? This would require that you do a little bit of research, and I guess my hope was that maybe you would, but it was also in the articles that I asked you to read. So it was there. Anybody? Thank you, Jackie. Would you repeat that orally for the class? Don't be shy, Jackie. Okay, I'm sorry. So Jackie correctly said what the Fed did was they knocked interest rates down towards 0. And the way they do that is by increasing dramatically the size of their portfolio. They bought trillions of dollars of mortgage-backed securities and treasury securities. And to do that, they created out of thin air, they created reserves. Those reserves found their way into the financial system. They bought all of these securities, driving up their price, driving down their yield. It's like a seesaw. One goes up, the other goes down. So if the price of the securities goes up, the yield goes down. They drove them basically to 0. And they hope that if you put all of this liquidity, all of these reserves into the banking system and drive interest rates down towards 0, there would be a lot of borrowing. Credit growth would expand. You'd see great demand for things for which people borrow, like houses and cars and businesses and all of that, driving up prices, and you get more inflation. The only thing was it became overwhelmed by a number of different things, and that is, for a number of different reasons, banks were not lending a lot of those reserves that ended up in the banking system. Number 2, the dollar was really strong, so imports were really cheap. Commodity prices fell sharply, so you didn't get any kind of cost push inflation. We were importing vast amounts of stuff from abroad at really cheap prices, so you had import competition driving things down. We went to a world that became more digitized, and things that are digital are really so much cheaper than things that aren't digital. You put all of these kinds of things, plus changing demographics, the population got older. Older people tend to spend less, except on things like medical care, which I could write a book about. You look at all of these things and you go, yeah, there really was not growth in aggregate demand on a sustained basis greater than the growth in aggregate supply. And so prices didn't go up. It's really as simple as that. What impacts on the economy and the financial system would there be if inflation rates are well above the Fed's target? Well, that goes back to the various slides that you have in this particular PowerPoint where we talked about inflation being, maybe higher than expected or higher than desired. And I said, look at the consequences of that, and therein would lie the answer to this question. So I hope what we just did is helpful to you. Many of you wrote very interesting answers for this, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you for your efforts. Trust me when I tell you they're well noted in my spreadsheets. And I guess that's it for this week. I really enjoyed today's class. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your participation. I really hope that you have a great weekend. Tomorrow and Friday are going to be really warm. The weekend is going to be cooler, but enjoy it. Enjoy every day. Enjoy every day of your life, because you just never know what tomorrow is going to bring you. And always tell the people that you love them, and give them, if you can, a hug and a kiss. I do that. I just wish my family were here. My family is in another city. My wife is here. But all of that said, always be sure to tell the people you love that you love them. Thanks, folks.
All right, take care,
Great
sir.
class.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Great class. Thanks for being with us.